In the autumn of 1996, a man named John du Pont barricaded himself inside his mansion. He was 57 years old. He was one of the richest men in Pennsylvania. He was the heir to the DuPont chemical fortune, the fortune built on gunpowder and nylon and Teflon and the industrial chemistry that had helped win 2 world wars and had made the DuPont family the closest thing to a dynasty that democratic America had produced. He owned 800 acres in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, a training facility for Olympic wrestlers, a natural history museum, a private railroad car, and a gun collection of considerable size. 2 days earlier, he had walked up to Olympic gold medal wrestler Dave Schultz outside a building on the estate and shot him 3 times in front of witnesses. He was inside the mansion now. The police were outside. The negotiations went on for 2 days. He came out when the police cut off the heat and he walked outside to fix the boiler. They arrested him in the snow. At trial, his lawyers argued he was insane. The evidence was substantial. He had told people he was the Dalai Lama. He had told people he was the Christ child. He had told people he was the last czar of Russia. He had lined the walls and attic of the mansion with razor wire to keep out intruders. He had dug up portions of the estate looking for underground tunnels. He had believed in the months before the murder that Dave Schultz, a man who had given years of his life to the wrestling program John funded, was an enemy agent working against him. The jury found him guilty, but mentally ill. He died in prison in 2010. His family said almost nothing throughout, not at the trial, not after the verdict, not at his death. A spokesperson offered brief statements. The family closed around the silence the way the DuPont family had always closed around its silences, with money and lawyers and the discipline of people who had been keeping secrets for a long time. Now here is the question this video is going to answer. John du Pont was not the first. He was not the most hidden. He was the one who made the newspapers because the murder was too public to erase, because the witnesses were there and the cameras were there, and the story was too large for the family to absorb and disappear the way it had absorbed and disappeared other stories, other people, other inconvenient facts about what happened to the DuPonts, who broke the unwritten rule of the family's public life. The unwritten rule was this: the DuPonts are a dynasty. Dynasties require a public face. The public face requires management. The management requires that certain things, certain people, not appear. The question is, who was erased before John made erasing impossible? The question is, what happens when a family with enough money and enough lawyers and enough Delaware judges decides that a person is a problem to be managed rather than a member to be loved? The question is what the room looks like and who is in it and how long they stay. Drop your city in the comments, and if these stories matter to you, subscribe. Now let us go back to the Brandywine Creek in Delaware in 1802, to the French immigrant who built the gunpowder mill that became the most powerful industrial dynasty in American history, and let us find out what that dynasty did with the people who did not fit. Eleuthère Irénée du Pont de Nemours arrived in America in 1800 with his father Pierre Samuel and a plan. The plan was gunpowder. He had trained in France under the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, and he had understood, watching the American frontier expand, and the young nation build its infrastructure and arm its militia, that the country needed gunpowder in quantities that no existing domestic manufacturer could supply. He found land on the Brandywine Creek in Delaware, where the water could power the mills. He found investors, including his father. He built the mills. He began producing powder. The Brandywine Creek was a good choice for reasons beyond the water power. The creek ran through country that was isolated enough to provide safety buffers around the mills, because gunpowder mills explode regularly and catastrophically, and the DuPont family understood from the beginning that the business they were in was a business in which the workplace could kill everyone in it without warning. The mills exploded. People died. The DuPonts rebuilt. They absorbed the losses, financial and human, and they rebuilt, and they kept making powder. This willingness to absorb loss and continue, take what the business cost and keep going, was not simply commercial calculation. It was temperament. The DuPonts who survived the 19th century were people who had learned, From the mills and the explosions and the family tragedies that the business produced, that forward motion was the only available response to catastrophe. You did not stop. You did not look back. You managed what could be managed, and you erased what could be erased, and you kept producing. By the time of the Civil War, the DuPont Company supplied the Union Army with 40% of its gunpowder. By the end of the 19th century, it had diversified into other explosives and chemicals and had accumulated enough market power that the federal government eventually sued it for antitrust violations. By the early 20th century, after a restructuring forced by the federal suit, it was producing the new chemical materials, nylon, neoprene, Teflon, lucite, that made it one of the defining industrial companies of the American century. The family that ran this company was, at its peak in the early 20th century, the single most economically powerful family in Delaware. They employed a significant fraction of the state's workforce. They owned its banks and its newspapers and its political relationships. They built its hospitals and its museums and its parks. They were, in the language the era used for such things, the first family of Delaware, the family whose name was on the state the way other names were on less small and less thoroughly owned places. They were also, from the beginning, a family with secrets. Alfred the Fern DuPont's mother was committed to an asylum when he was 13 years old. She died within a week of her commitment. His father died of tuberculosis a month later. Alfred and his siblings were orphaned at 13, and the family's first instinct, consistent with everything the DuPont dynasty would demonstrate for the next 100 years, was to separate the children and sell the family home. Alfred resisted. He kept the family together by force of will. But the lesson was in the resistance. The institution's instinct was disposal. The orphaned children were a problem to be managed. Alfred managed himself instead. He went to work in the powder mills at 16. He learned the business from the bottom. He rose. He became one of the most important figures in the company's restructuring in 1902, when the three cousins, Alfred T. Coleman and Pierre, took control of a company whose older generation had run it into complacency and reorganized it into something competitive. He also, in the process, made enemies of his own family on a scale that the DuPont history has rarely matched. The DuPont family feuds of the early 20th century are the internal record of what happens when a dynasty turns its management instincts on its own members. Alfred I DuPont divorced his first wife, Bessie Gardner, in 1906, a divorce that the family found scandalous enough to produce a rupture that lasted years. He remarried in 1907 to Alicia Bradford, a divorced second cousin whose relationship with Alfred had been the subject of family gossip before either of their divorces was final. The family's response was to cut Alfred out of the company. His cousin Pierre DuPont engineered his removal from the board and from significant management roles. Alfred spent years in legal battles to recover his position and his share of the company that his own labor had helped build. He fought the family the way he had always fought, relentlessly in the courts, using every instrument available. He won some battles, he lost others. He never fully recovered his position within the DuPont company hierarchy, and he eventually moved to Florida, where he spent his later years building a different kind of legacy. Funding a bank, building infrastructure for rural Floridians, establishing the Nemours Foundation that would eventually operate children's hospitals in his name. He died in 1935. His third wife, Jessie Ball DuPont, administered his estate and became one of the most significant philanthropists in the American South. His daughter Madeleine, the child he had maintained contact with from his first marriage, the one he had kept a relationship with while largely severing ties with his other first marriage children, settled in Munich, Germany. Alfred's letters to Madeleine document decades of correspondence, a father maintaining a connection across an ocean, while the family that surrounded him in Delaware managed the public image of the dynasty. What the correspondence shows, in the fragments that have been made available, is a man who understood what his family did to its inconvenient members and who was trying across the distance of an ocean to protect the relationship that mattered to him. He was one of the inconvenient members himself. Alfred DuPont's mother, Charlotte Shepard Henderson, had been committed to an asylum in 1877. She had a history of what the era called mental illness, what the records, such as they are, describe with the imprecision of 19th century psychiatric language. Episodes, instability, the kind of behavior that produced in the people around her the conviction that professional management was required. She was committed. Within a week, she was dead. The official cause of death is not the subject of sustained historical inquiry. The timing, Pine, committed and dead within 7 days, sits in the historical record as a fact, noted and then passed over, in the way that facts about powerful families that cannot be comfortably explained tend to be noted and passed over. Alfred was 13. His father, Eleuthère Irénée du Pont II, died of tuberculosis a month later. The family was orphaned. What Alfred grew up knowing about what had happened to his mother, what he understood about the speed of her death and the circumstances of her commitment, is not recorded. What is recorded is that he spent the rest of his life in difficult relationship with the Du Pont family institutions, that he fought the family publicly and in court over his share of the company, that he eventually left Delaware and built his legacy in Florida. The pattern that his mother's story represents, the commitment, the silence, the institutional management of a person who was inconvenient, would repeat itself in the family across the next 100 years. Not always in asylums, not always in formal institutions, but that instinct to contain and control and eventually erase the people who did not fit the dynasty's public requirements persisted through generations in ways that the individual cases, taken together, reveal. Charlotte Henderson's story is the first case, the most obscured, the one that the official histories of the Du Pont family address in a sentence, if at all. She was there, she was managed, she was gone. The inbreeding was real and it mattered. The Du Pont family married within itself for generations, not by accident or proximity, but by design. The design of a family that understood its chemical company as a family property, and that understood family property as something to be kept within the family. The cousins married cousins. The nieces married the nephews of their parents' cousins. The family tree is less a tree than a network of loops, each generation folding back on the previous one in ways that the geneticists who have studied the family describe with the neutral language of population genetics, and that the family members who lived inside it experienced as something else. The genetic consequences of sustained consanguinity are well documented. Recessive traits that would be statistically unlikely to express in an outbred population become more likely when the same gene pool marries into itself repeatedly. The mental illness that appears in one generation does not disappear from the gene pool between generations. It concentrates. The Du Ponts had, across the 19th and early 20th centuries, an unusual incidence of what would today be diagnosed as serious mental illness: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, the delusional thinking that John du Pont would eventually express so publicly that it could no longer be contained. The family knew this. The family managed it the way it managed everything, by applying resources and control and, when necessary, removal. The specific mechanisms of removal changed across the era. In the 19th century, the mechanisms were asylums and distance and death. In the early 20th century, they were private sanitariums and extended European travel and marriages arranged to remove the problematic person from the Delaware Circle. In the mid-20th century, they were psychiatric facilities and trust arrangements and the legal structures that the Du Pont family's relationships with Delaware courts made available to them. The family had those relationships. Delaware was their state. The judges who presided over Du Pont family legal matters were people who operated within the institutional world that the Du Pont family had built and funded and maintained. This was not conspiracy exactly. It was the normal operation of inherited power in a small state where one family has been dominant for 2 centuries. When the family needed to manage a member, the state's institutions were available for the management. Ethel DuPont Roosevelt Warren was born on January 30, 1916, and died on May 25, 1965, by suicide at 49 years old. Between those dates, she had been briefly the most publicly visible member of the DuPont family. She had married Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. in 1937 in a ceremony that brought together the 2 most prominent American dynastic families of the New Deal era. the Du Ponts and the Roosevelts, in a union that the press covered as the social event of the year. The marriage lasted 12 years. The divorce in 1949 was covered with the same intensity as the wedding, and the coverage noted delicately that the marriage had not been happy, that Ethel Du Pont Roosevelt had not been well during much of it, that she had struggled in ways that the newspaper accounts of the period described with the vocabulary of marital difficulty rather than the vocabulary of psychiatric illness. She married again in 1950 to Benjamin S. Warren Jr. She had 3 children. She spent time in the years between the second marriage and her death at the Silver Hill Foundation in New Canaan, Connecticut, a private psychiatric facility that the wealthy used for the management of mental illness that required more than outpatient attention. She died in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan in May of 1965 by her own hand, while her son Benjamin was away at boarding school and she and her husband were separated. Her family endowed a fellowship at Harvard Medical School in her name, the Ethel Du Pont Warren Fellowship in Psychiatry, which is the kind of gesture that wealthy families make when a death is too public to manage by silence alone and too painful to manage by anything other than the conversion of the private grief into a public contribution. She had been, in the 15 years between her divorce from Roosevelt and her death, the Du Pont family member whose life most visibly demonstrated the pattern, the psychiatric care, the periodic institutionalization, the silence that surrounded these facts in the family's public communications, the death that the family addressed in the language of endowment rather than the language of examination. She was 49 years old. The family said what families say. Then they moved on. John Du Pont's story is the one that could not be moved on from, because the body was there, and the witnesses were there, and the cameras arrived before the lawyers could. He had been, for decades before the murder, the kind of person that the Du Pont family management system was designed to handle. The paranoid episodes, the bizarre beliefs, the escalating delusional thinking that the people around him observed and documented. And then, because he was rich and because his wealth made the estate and the training facilities possible, and because the wrestling program was achieving real things in the world, accommodated. His mother, Jean Austin Du Pont, had kept the raps on him, as a longtime estate employee would say after her death. She had maintained the management. She had provided the structure that contained the illness and allowed the functioning parts of John's life, the collections, the philanthropy, the wrestling program, to continue operating. She died in 1988. 8 years later, John walked out of a building and shot Dave Schultz in front of witnesses. The 8 years between his mother's death and the murder are the 8 years in which the management structure that had contained him collapsed. Without Jean Austin Du Pont to keep the raps on him, the illness metastasized at a rate that the people around him could observe but could not stop. They accommodated, they rationalized. They stayed because the money was there and the program was there, and because leaving would have required them to say directly what they were all watching. The accommodation ended on January 26, 1996. The family's response, the closing around the silence, the spokesperson's statements, the private management of the aftermath, was the same response the family had applied to every previous crisis. The difference was that this time, the crisis had already been documented by the people who had been present for it, and the cameras had been present for the arrest, and the trial was a public proceeding in a county courthouse in Pennsylvania, rather than a private arrangement in a Delaware court. The family was not, for once, in control of the information. What the Du Pont family's history reveals, across 2 centuries of managing its inconvenient members, is not a conspiracy, but a system. The system was built from the same instincts that had built the company. The instinct for forward motion, for absorption and continuation, for managing loss in ways that allowed the enterprise to keep going. The company had absorbed the explosions and rebuilt. The family absorbed its damaged members and rebuilt around them. The rebuilding required erasure. The person who had been removed, whose illness or deviation had made them a management problem, was not simply hidden. They were reclassified. They became, in the family's internal accounting, a cost to be managed rather than a person to be known. The cost was the private facility, or the European arrangement, or the trust structure, or the silence in the family correspondence. The person remained a person, presumably in their own experience. In the family's accounting, they were a line item. This is not unique to the du Ponts. It is what dynasties do with their inconvenient members. What every family with enough money and enough institutional relationships to manage the consequences does when a member breaks the public face that the dynasty requires. The du Ponts were unusual only in the scale of the resources available for the management and the completeness of the control they could exercise in a state small enough to be comprehensively owned. What makes the du Pont history worth examining is precisely what the title of this video suggests: the room. Not one room, not one person, but the institution of the room. The practice of taking the people who do not fit and putting them somewhere that the official family narrative does not require acknowledging. The practice that began with Charlotte Henderson in 1877 and continued through Ethel du Pont Roosevelt's institutionalizations and John du Pont's private accommodations of his own deteriorating mind until the body on the driveway at Foxcatcher Farm made the room impossible to maintain. The room was always there. The people in it were real. Some of them have names in the record. Many do not. Dave Schultz was 36 years old when John du Pont shot him. He was an Olympic champion. He had won the gold medal in freestyle wrestling at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics and the World Championship at several world competitions in subsequent years. He had come to Foxcatcher Farm because John du Pont had offered him the training facility and the resources and the sense of mission that the wrestling program represented, and because Dave Schultz was the kind of person who believed in the mission and wanted to help the younger wrestlers who trained there. He had observed John's deterioration. He had stayed anyway. The accounts of the people who knew both men described Dave Schultz as someone who understood what was happening with John, and who believed, perhaps naively, perhaps with the specific faith of someone who is committed to a place and a mission, that his presence was stabilizing. His widow, Nancy Schultz, spent the years after the murder pursuing not only the criminal case but the civil accountability of the people who had known about John's condition and had kept him in proximity to the wrestlers on the estate. The settlements that resulted were part of the legal record of what everyone around John du Pont had known, and when they had known it. The family knew. The people closest to John knew. The accommodation had been going on for years. The accommodation had been possible because accommodation was what the system produced, because the money made accommodation the path of least resistance for everyone who depended on the money, and because the alternative to accommodation was the discomfort of saying directly what everyone was watching. Dave Schultz paid for the accommodation with his life. His name is the name that the story of John du Pont most forcefully contains, not the name of the du Pont family member who pulled the trigger. That is not how the history books tell it. The history books tell it as the story of the du Pont heir, who was found guilty but mentally ill, who died in prison, whose collections and estate were sold, whose name remains on the Foxcatcher Farm property that is now a county park. Dave Schultz's name is on the park too. He is buried in California. His widow still speaks about him. On the Du Pont Company today, the company that Eleuthère Irénée du Pont built from a gunpowder mill on the Brandywine Creek in 1802, has been through multiple mergers and restructurings, and is now part of a combined entity formed from the 2017 merger of DuPont and Dow Chemical, subsequently separated into 3 independent companies. The family no longer controls it. The family no longer controls Delaware in the way it once controlled Delaware. There are still DuPonts in the state. There are still DuPont names on buildings and foundations and charitable institutions, and the Nemours Children's Hospitals that Alfred the First DuPont established, and that still serve children who have no connection to the family that built them. The management is not as available as it once was. The Delaware courts are not as comprehensively the DuPont family's institutional property as they were in the era when the family employed a significant fraction of the state. The money is still substantial. The family's trust structures and foundations maintain wealth that outlasts corporate restructuring. But the grip of a single family on a single small state has loosened across the decades in the way that all such grips loosen. What does not loosen is the record. The record of Charlotte Henderson, committed in 1877 and dead within a week. The record of Ethel du Pont Roosevelt, the most publicly visible DuPont of her generation, who spent her final years in and out of psychiatric facilities and died at 49, and whose death the family addressed in the language of endowment. The record of John du Pont, who deteriorated across decades while the people around him accommodated, and who shot a man in front of witnesses on a January afternoon because the accommodation had run its course, and the record of the people who do not have names in the easily searchable sources. The members who were managed so effectively, so early, with such complete control of the information that the management itself is the most complete record we have. The room was real. The people in it were real. Some of them are still being paid for in the accounting of the foundations and the trusts and the private arrangements that the family's wealth makes possible. Some of them are simply gone. The company is still on the Brandywine Creek. The mills that exploded and killed people and were rebuilt and kept producing are a museum now. The Hagley Museum and Library, founded by Louise DuPont Crowninshield, one of the family members who converted the physical infrastructure of the dynasty into something the public could visit and learn from. She was one of the ones who fit. The ones who did not fit are elsewhere. Some of them are in the record. Some of them are in the room. That is the story of the DuPont family and the people they erased. The room is still there. The names are almost there. That has to be enough. That is the whole of it. The chemical company that Eleuthère Irénée Dupont built from a gunpowder mill in 1802 became, over the course of the 19th century, the largest explosives manufacturer in the United States. The path was not smooth. The mills exploded regularly. An 1818 explosion killed 40 workers. A series of accidents in the 1840s and 1850s killed more. Each time, the family rebuilt. Each time, the business continued. The willingness to accept catastrophic loss as a cost of doing business was not simply commercial necessity. It was the family's fundamental relationship with risk, shaped by 2 generations of living adjacent to structures that could and did kill the people inside them. The Civil War transformed the company from a significant regional manufacturer into a national institution. The Union Army needed powder in quantities that no other domestic manufacturer could supply. DuPont supplied it, approximately 40% of the Union's total powder consumption over the course of the war, including the powder used at Gettysburg, at the Siege of Petersburg, at Sherman's march through Georgia. The family's fortune, which had been substantial before the war, became something larger afterward. The transition from the 19th century to the 20th required a restructuring that nearly destroyed the company before it rebuilt it. When the elderly Eugene DuPont, who had been running the company, died in 1902 without a clear succession plan, the board of directors proposed selling the entire operation to a competitor, Laughlin and Rand, one of the other major explosives companies. Alfred Turner DuPont intervened. He argued that the company should not be sold outside the family, that there were members of the family who could run it. He recruited his cousins T. Coleman DuPont and Pierre S. DuPont to join him in purchasing the company from the estate. They paid almost nothing for it. The 3 cousins acquired the company using its own projected earnings as collateral, a leveraged buyout a century before the term existed, and then proceeded to restructure it into a modern corporation with centralized management, specialized departments, and the kind of organizational sophistication that the industry required to compete at scale. The restructuring worked. By 1907, the reorganized DuPont Company controlled approximately 70% of the American explosives market. The federal government filed an antitrust suit. In 1912, a court ordered the company to divest portions of its explosives business. The divested portions became the Hercules and Atlas powder companies. DuPont, reduced but not broken, turned its attention and its chemical expertise toward new materials. The new materials were the story of the 20th century DuPont. Nylon, introduced in 1938, first used in women's stockings, then in parachutes and tire cords and ropes during the Second World War, then again in stockings when the war ended and the nylon that had been requisitioned for the military returned to the civilian market. The nylon craze of 1945, when department stores in major cities opened to lines of women stretching around the block on the first day nylon stockings were back on sale, was a measure of what DuPont's chemical research had produced. Neoprene, synthetic rubber, introduced in 1930. Teflon, discovered accidentally in 1938 when a DuPont chemist found that a fluorocarbon compound had created a substance with unprecedented non-stick properties. Lucite, Mylar, Kevlar, each one a compound developed in the laboratories that the DuPont family's investment in industrial chemistry had built and staffed. By the middle of the 20th century, the DuPont Company was one of the 5 or 10 most powerful corporations in the United States, and the DuPont family was the single richest family in America by some measures. The General Motors connection, Pierre S. DuPont had used company funds to purchase a controlling stake in General Motors in the 1910s and 1920s, a relationship that the government would eventually force the company to unwind, made the family's wealth and industrial reach even more extraordinary. They owned a chemical company. They owned a significant portion of the automobile industry. They owned Delaware. Delaware is a small state. It is the second smallest state in the Union by area and one of the smallest by population. It borders Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. It is known in the contemporary world primarily as the state where corporations incorporate. Its corporate law is favorable to businesses, and its Court of Chancery has centuries of corporate law expertise that makes it the preferred jurisdiction for corporate legal proceedings. It was known in the late 19th and early 20th century primarily as the state where the DuPonts lived. This is not hyperbole. The DuPont family, at the height of its influence over Delaware, employed a significant fraction of the state's manufacturing workforce in the powder mills and chemical plants and related industries that lined the Brandywine. The banks that held the family's money and financed the state's commerce were DuPont institutions. The newspapers that covered Delaware's public life were owned, at various points, by DuPont family members. The politicians who served in the state legislature and the Congress had relationships with the family that ranged from friendly to dependent. T. Coleman DuPont personally funded and supervised the construction of a boulevard from the Maryland border to the state line with Pennsylvania, a 100-mile road that he built as a gift to the state of Delaware, which gave the family the specific public position that roads named for wealthy men provide. The DuPont Highway, U.S. Route 13, still runs through Delaware. Henry Algernon DuPont served as a United States Senator from Delaware from 1906 to 1917, elected by the state legislature in the era before direct election of senators. His election was secured through the family's relationships with the legislators who made the choice, which was how things worked in Delaware and in many other states in the era before the 17th Amendment changed the mechanism. Alfred Thetford DuPont bought Delaware's 2 largest newspapers in 1913, the Wilmington Morning News and the Wilmington Evening Journal, and used them as instruments for political purposes that included the support of candidates friendly to his interests and the opposition of candidates and policies he found inconvenient. He eventually sold the newspapers, but not before they had demonstrated that the family's control of Delaware extended to the information environment in which the state's civic life took place. When the family needed to manage one of its members, when the asylum was needed, or the trust arrangement was needed, or the private legal proceeding was needed, the mechanisms of management were available in a way they would not have been available in a state where the family was simply one wealthy family among many, rather than the dominant institution of a small state's entire civic and economic life. The management was easy to maintain in Delaware. Alfred I DuPont's feuds with his family occupied the central decades of his professional life and produced in him the specific understanding of how the DuPont management system worked from the inside. The understanding of someone who had been at various points both operator and subject of the system. He had worked in the powder mills as a teenager. He had risen through the company by merit rather than inheritance. He had been instrumental in the 1902 restructuring that saved the company from outside sale. And then, when his personal life produced situations that the family found inconvenient, the divorce from Bessie Gardner, the remarriage to Alicia Bradford, the feuds with Pierre and Coleman over control of the company, the family turned the management system on him. The response took the form of legal and corporate maneuver rather than institutionalization. Alfred was too prominent, too capable, too embedded in the company's operational life to be disposed of quietly. But the instinct was the same. He was inconvenient. He was to be managed. He fought back in the courts. He won some cases. He lost others. He never recovered his full position within the company. The cousins, Pierre most effectively, consolidated control of DuPont in ways that left Alfred with a diminished role despite his contribution to building it. He responded by buying newspapers and entering Delaware politics and building a financial empire in Florida, where the DuPont family had less institutional control, where his money and intelligence could operate without the interference of a family that had decided he was a problem. The Nemours Foundation, which he established and which his wife Jessie Ball DuPont administered after his death, became one of the most significant charitable institutions in the American South. The Alfred DeFreed DuPont Hospital for Children, which the foundation operates in Wilmington, Delaware, bears his name, which is the specific irony of the DuPont story, that the man the family had managed out of his primary role ended up with the most durable philanthropic legacy of his generation of the family. He died in 1935. Jessie continued. The foundation continued. The Children's Hospital on the land near the original DuPont family seat in Delaware has treated generations of children who have no connection to the family quarrels that produced the philanthropy that built it. The quarrels produced something lasting. The management produced something too. The bitterness and the exile and the legal battles that shaped Alfred's life after the family turned on him. Both were real. Ethel DuPont Roosevelt's wedding to Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. on June 30, 1937, was described by the newspapers as the social event of the season, perhaps of the decade. The bride was 21 years old, the daughter of Eugene DuPont Jr. and Ethel Pyle DuPont, a granddaughter of the Eugene DuPont who had been the first head of the modern DuPont Corporation. She had grown up at Owl's Nest, the family estate in Greenville, Delaware, attended Mrs. Hebb's school in Wilmington, and graduated from the Ethel Walker School in Simsbury, Connecticut. She was described in the newspaper accounts of the engagement as beautiful, accomplished, athletic. The groom was 23 years old, the son of the President of the United States and Eleanor Roosevelt, a Harvard graduate whose primary qualification for marriage at that moment in history was the accident of his parentage. The wedding was at the DuPont estate in Greenville. The President and First Lady attended. The guest list was a document of the combined social worlds of two dynasties: the industrial wealth of Wilmington, Delaware, and the political aristocracy of the New Deal, Washington. The press coverage was extensive and entirely celebratory. What the press coverage did not address, because it was not known at the time or was known and suppressed, was that Ethel DuPont was already showing signs of the psychological fragility that would organize the rest of her life. The marriage was troubled from early on. Franklin Roosevelt Jr. was not a faithful husband. He had his father's temperament in this as in several other respects. He was also a man who was constitutionally unsuited for the sustained domestic presence that Ethel's condition required. He was out. He was present when it suited him. He was not, by the accounts of the people who observed the marriage from the outside, a partner in the way that Ethel needed a partner. They divorced in 1949. The settlement gave Ethel custody of their 3 children. It gave her the financial provisions that a DuPont divorce settlement provided. It did not give her the stability that she needed and that the marriage had not produced. She married Benjamin Warren in 1950. She had hoped for better. She got something she could sustain, at least for a while. The psychiatric care began or escalated in the years after the divorce. The Silver Hill Foundation in New Canaan, Connecticut, the private psychiatric facility where the wealthy went when the condition required something more than the private doctor and the private nurse that money provided at home. Silver Hill was not a state institution. It was not the kind of place that the phrase "locked away" evokes. It was the best available care for the people who could afford the best available care. She went there more than once. She was 49 years old in May of 1965. Her son Benjamin was 10 years old and away at boarding school. She and her husband were separated. She was found on May 25, 1965. The family endowed the fellowship at Harvard Medical School. The DuPont name was on it. The cause of death was addressed in the appropriate language of a family that understood how to manage information. She had been the most publicly visible DuPont of her generation. She had been the bride at the social event of the decade. She had been managed, in the end, into a footnote. She was 49 years old. The fellowship is still awarded. John du Pont grew up in the shadow of his mother, Jean Austen du Pont, a woman whose management of her youngest child shaped everything that followed. She kept the raps on him. That was the description that a longtime employee offered after Jane Austen's death, and it was accurate in a way that the neutral language of family management does not fully capture. She maintained the structure that contained him. She maintained the estate at Foxcatcher Farm in Newtown Square. She maintained the financial arrangements and the institutional relationships and the social buffer that allowed John to function, to pursue the collections and the philanthropy and eventually the wrestling program. Without his deteriorating mental state becoming publicly visible, the collections were extraordinary. He assembled one of the finest collections of seashells in the world, tens of thousands of specimens, significant enough that they required museum space to house, and that attracted scholarly attention from malacologists. He collected stamps, including the world's rarest known stamp. He collected tin toys and Staffordshire china and silverware and birds. The bird collection was so large that he opened a museum specifically to house it. He was, in these collecting activities, genuinely accomplished. The collections toured. They were exhibited in museums. He attended the exhibitions anonymously, apparently content to watch people interact with what he had assembled without needing to announce that he had assembled it. This is the part of John du Pont's story that the Foxcatcher narrative tends to erase, that he was not simply a delusional rich man who thought he was the Dalai Lama. He was also a man who had built real things, who had funded real achievements in amateur wrestling, who had given real resources to hundreds of students and athletes, who had assembled objects of genuine beauty and scientific value. He was also, for decades before the murder, a man who was deteriorating in ways that the people around him could observe and did observe and found reasons to accommodate. The wrestling program at Foxcatcher was real and its achievements were real. Dave Schultz was there because the program was legitimate. The young wrestlers who trained on the estate were there because the facilities were excellent and the resources were substantial, and the mission to build American Olympic wrestling into a world-class program was one that serious athletes could commit to. John believed himself to be the patron and protector of all of this. He believed himself to be, in some sense, the founder and sustainer of American wrestling. The belief was not entirely delusional. He had given real money and real support, and the program had produced real results. But the belief had also, in the years before the murder, calcified into something that could not accommodate contradiction. Dave Schultz's presence on the estate, his visibility, his rapport with the other wrestlers, his genuine standing as the most accomplished athlete in the program, had become, in John's deteriorating perception, a threat. The murder made sense from inside the delusion. It made no sense from outside it. The family had known the delusion was there. The family had maintained the raps for decades. The family had counted on Jane Austen du Pont to keep the raps on him, and Jane Austen had died in 1988. And 8 years later, John shot Dave Schultz on a January afternoon in front of witnesses. The raps were off. The aftermath of the Foxcatcher murder is a study in the operation of the du Pont management system under conditions it was not designed to handle. The system was designed for situations that could be managed through the family's institutional relationships, through the Delaware courts and the family's lawyers and the trust structures and the private arrangements that 2 centuries of power in a small state make available. It was designed for situations where the information could be controlled. It was not designed for a dead body on a driveway with witnesses and cameras. Nancy Schultz, Dave's widow, was not the kind of person who could be managed. She was a woman who had watched her husband be murdered, who had 3 children to raise and a cause to pursue, who understood exactly what had happened and who had access to the legal system, even if that system was less completely the du Pont family's instrument than the Delaware system had been. She pursued the civil case. The settlements that resulted were part of the record of who had known what and when about John du Pont's condition. The record was not favorable to the people around John who had accommodated his deterioration in exchange for the financial benefits his wealth provided. The family, and the du Pont family writ large, the network of cousins and foundations and institutional relationships, retreated into the silence that was its default response to inconvenient information. The spokesperson's statements, the brief acknowledgments, the conversion of private grief and public scandal into the language of management. John's sister, Jeanne du Pont, who was 83 years old at the time of the trial, was appointed one of the trustees of his estate while he was incarcerated. She did not appear at the trial. She did not comment publicly on her brother's condition or the family's awareness of it. He spent the rest of his life in a series of state institutions. He died in prison in 2010. He left most of his estate not to a family member, but to a Bulgarian wrestler named Valentin Yordanov, who had trained at Foxcatcher and who had medaled at the 1996 Olympics. The estate was sold, the collections were dispersed, the championship wrestling program ended. The 800 acres in Newtown Square became a county park. The park is called Foxcatcher Farm County Park. Dave Schultz's name is on it too. John du Pont is buried in his Team Foxcatcher wrestling singlet, per his own request. He is the only member of the Forbes 400 richest Americans ever convicted of murder.